This interview is a part of the Oklahoma Historical Society's oral history program, Living Legends Collection. This interview was originally conducted on the 9th of November, 1970. The interview was conducted by Mrs. Maydell Jones. That's Maydell Jones. The interviewee is Mr. A.O. Martin of Stillwater, Oklahoma. This interview was re-recorded on the 18th of December, 1985 for inclusion in the permanent collections of the oral history program by Judith Michener.
November the 9th, 1970. This is Mrs. Mack Jones interviewing Mr. A.O. Martin of Stillwater, Oklahoma, Emeritus Director of the Alumni Association, Oklahoma State University, Emeritus Director of the University Placement Bureau, Oklahoma State University. Mr. Martin, would you like to tell us something about your early background?
Oh, well, yes, I would be glad to tell you most anything, but I don't know where to start and where to stop.
Well, let's start with being born.
I was born in the state of Kansas up in Miami County near Lewisburg on a farm. We left there when I was 2 years of age and moved to a farm in Blaine County, Oklahoma near Watonga. And that was where I was reared and went to country school. I graduated from the 8th grade and very soon thereafter I started teaching. Because, in fact, I had only 4 weeks normal training before I started teaching in the country school.
How big was your first school, Mr. Martin?
Well, there were about 30 enrolled.
And how old were you?
I was 18 at that time.
You were doing well, weren't you?
Well, it was a very interesting experience.
And that was when you, what was your salary then?
$45 a month for 6 months. I used to think about it. We taught 20 days for a month. That was $2.25 a day. Good pay.
And then you said that you started farming then for a while.
Well, I was reared on a farm, and I continued to farm at the time I was teaching. Of course, I farmed with the family, but we were given acreages of our own, the different members of the family, to farm and at the same time contribute to the general family farming. So we had a personal income from that farming to the degree that we were successful in farming.
Uh-huh. I don't think I really. Oh. Then when was it that you came to OAMC?
I came here first in the fall of 1913 as a sub-freshman.
And then you taught a year.
Well, I was in school for 2 years
Oh, I see.
at OAMC. Then I dropped out a year to teach in a rural school again in 1915 and 16.
And I see your salary went up then.
I got $60 a month that year for 6 months and stayed at home and went 5 miles on horseback.
And then you
Came back to school the following year and was here for 2 years. And in May of 1918, May 7th, I enlisted in the U.S. Navy and lacked just about 15 hours of having my degree. And I stayed in the Navy then until the following year, February 5, when I was given a discharge and allowed to come back and finish my college degree with the 1919 class.
And you were assistant agent that year.
Well, that's a rather unique experience. I had taken a pretty broad course in college, including a lot of education and a good many hours in agriculture, and the extension service at the institution had some federal money that had to be spent before the end of the fiscal year. So I was acquainted with some of the people in the extension, and they offered me a job as assistant agent starting the 15th of May, and the money, of course, was exhausted on July 1st. So I worked for 6 weeks at $150 a month for the Extension Division in Kay County.
Uh-huh. And then you went, became superintendent of schools then.
Well, that same summer, following my experience as assistant county agent, I had a friend, Henry Dunleavy, who had been down in Greer County and said there were a number of consolidated schools there where they needed teachers and wondered why I didn't go down. So after my assistant county agent work was completed, I wrote a letter down to Milton Butler, the county superintendent of Greer County, telling him about my training and my rural experience. And immediately upon receipt of the letter, he called me up. I went down to see him, got there about noon on Monday, and before sundown I'd signed a contract to teach as superintendent of schools at Brinkman.
Mm-hmm. And from Brinkman you went to Walters and then to Veneta.
I was at Brinkman 3 years, at Walters as high school principal for 1 year, and at Veneta as high school principal 1 year, and 6 years as superintendent of schools at Veneta. And from that position I came to Oklahoma State University, Oklahoma A&M at that time, and remained here at the university as director of the placement bureau and secretary of the former Students Association until my retirement in 1958.
Tell me something about your wife, Mr. Martin.
My wife taught with me at Brinkman. She was an Edmond graduate, and she didn't teach after we were married, but we had 3 children, all of whom were graduates of Oklahoma State University, and I had the misfortune to lose my wife about 8 months ago.
Oh, I'm so sorry. But you have some wonderful, says 10 grandchildren?
Yes, we have 10 grandchildren, 5 boys and 5 girls. We have 1 granddaughter who is a junior here at Oklahoma State University this year.
3rd generation.
And we have one who is a sophomore at Oklahoma University. The one in Oklahoma University is studying journalism, and the one here is studying science. And they're both doing very well, and we're quite proud of all of them.
That's fine. Now let's get into some of your activities, Mr. Martin. Your Literary Society and on down the things that you've been interested in.
Of course, Literary Society, if you want to get ancient history, or if you lived back 60 or 70 years ago, that was the one of the popular organizations in schools and in the country, and one in which young people learned a lot about debating, public speaking, and organizing programs and things of that kind. And here at Oklahoma A&M we had literary societies back in those days, and I was an active participant in the Philomathian Literary Society, took part in debating and in sometimes oratorical contests and all of the various types of programs that literary societies had then. We don't have them anymore, and I think it's certainly people who grew up without that experience miss a lot.
Yes, they do. There's really nothing that takes its place, is there?
I don't know of any other training that gives a person the opportunity. There are things, of course, that there are different things now. They still get opportunities along to do a great many things and to learn to speak and act and perform. But that was, I guess, a primitive type of organization, but to me it is very valuable.
I know in so many of the old books and plays, the Literary Society was always the thing, the social event of the little towns, too.
Yes, that's right.
Now, this is when you were active in school, isn't it? The Student Senate and the Orange
Well, of
Board?
course, the Literary Society work dates clear back to the country when I graduated from the 8th grade when I was rather young, 14 years old, which is normal age, but I was 22 before I enrolled at Oklahoma A&M College as a sub-freshman. And during that interim of about 8 years there, I engaged in community activities of various kinds, and not the least of these was the Literary Society work we carried on in our rural community.
Mm-hmm. Then you were also active with the publications when you were in school.
Well, yes, we had student publications, a student newspaper. It's called the Orange and Black. It was a weekly at that time, and I was a little older than some of the others in my immediate class. I suppose that's the reason why I was chosen. But these positions in publications were elective positions, and my first experience along that line was when I was a freshman, and I was elected as editor-in-chief of the freshman edition of the Orange and Black. And then a couple of years later, I was elected editor of the sophomore edition of the Orange and Black. And then during my junior year and senior year, I was editor-in-chief for the weekly publication for the second semester of each of those 2 years.
You have a lot of outside activities now.
Well, there are some things that I do. I've been more or less active in civic work, as I've been a Rotarian for 46 years, 6 years at Veneta and 40 years in Stillwater, and of course I'm very proud of that connection.
Were you a charter member here?
No, I was not a charter member here. The Stillwater Rotary Club was founded in 1921, and see, I didn't move to Stillwater until 1930, and I had previously been a Rotarian at Veneta for 6 years. And of course I've been more or less active in the American Legion and had the honor of being post commander 3 or 4 years ago, and I still go to Legion meetings and go to Rotary and try to maintain friendships and contacts with people, with the community. I think that's really a part of life. It is for me.
Now, when you came into Stillwater, you came in as the director of the Placement Bureau?
And Alumni Secretary.
Uh-huh. And some of the things now that, had that just started at that time, the Placement Bureau?
The Placement Bureau was organized in 1929, summer of 1929. The former Students Association, as a full-time organization, was set up in 1928, and of course it was 2 years later that I came to the institution to take over the responsibility of handling the activities in the program for the former students organization as well as the placement. The former students at that time, really they had, when they were organized, had 2 main objects in view. One was to establish a placement service to be of assistance to graduates of the institution, and the other was to help the institution get stability. We had a setup in those days as really provided in the Constitution of Oklahoma for a Board of Regents made up of the Board of Agriculture, which was 1 elected state official, the president of the board, and 4 appointive members. And every time we got a new governor, we had 4 new appointees on the Board of Regents for our institution. And as a result, we changed presidents frequently, and we changed faculty members whenever the governor or any other high state official had someone that had to have a job. So the alumni were very much put out with having the institution made a political operation for the benefit of the friends of our elected officials, particularly the governor. So that was the big motive back of the formation of the former Student Association, stability for the institution, and the setup of a service department like the placement service to assist alumni and former students in finding their place in society.
I see. Does that still exist?
Oh, yes, those two organizations, those two objectives still are operated, and it still exists. It has expanded, and the placement service has now become a very valuable service to a lot of students and former students and to employers. And the Alumni Association, of course, has now the general purposes of all alumni organizations to continue a close working relationship between students and former students and the institution, because they really can help each other a lot, and their interests are identical. I used to preach a lot that those who anything that was good for the alumni was good for the institution, and that anything that added to the development and prestige of the institution added to the development and prestige of the alumni, that their interests were common, and they needed to maintain contacts in a relationship and to work together and for the welfare of both the institution and the alumni. And I still think that's a sound doctrine, that anything that helps the institution adds to its prestige, adds to the prestige of any individual who graduated from the institution, even though it might have been a good while ago.
Well, how did the Former Students Association overcome this political problem that you were speaking
Well, that's
of?
a long story.
I'm sure it would be interesting.
Well, of course, as I said a little bit ago, the institution was governed by the Board of Agriculture, which had many duties to perform in addition to being regents for the Oklahoma A&M College. And most of their time and activities were devoted to performing those duties of members of the Board of Agriculture in the interest of the agricultural activities in the state. Their work as regents for the institution was minor, and really it was very much a political board. They were appointed whenever we had a new governor. We had a complete new board, and if that board didn't function in accordance with the wishes of the governor by employing people he wanted employed or discharging people whom he wanted discharged, of course their tenure on the board could be cut off by the governor at any time. So the Board of Agriculture was very responsive to the wishes of the governor or any other one in high political favor in the state. And as a result, we had what we think of as instability. That is, there could be no continuity of policy, of institutional policy, beyond the immediate present. And every time there was a election of governor, the people on the staff and on the faculty, they were up in the air. They were in an uncertain state. Well, what's going to happen to you when the new board's elected? Well, I don't know. I'm packed. So the alumni didn't like that. Of course, it was climaxed, I think, as the first attention was directed to it back in 1921 when a president was let out, and I heard him make his final address, and he said, "The damn politicians put me in, the damn politicians put me out." And they went to a small institution in the state and got another man to come. The alumni didn't think they were doing a very wise thing in getting this other man. In fact, protested against his coming, but he came, and he stayed 2 years. At that time, he was allowed to leave, and during that year, 1923, those who remember that year will recall that we had 4 different men who sat in the president's chair during 1923.
What were their names, Mr. Martin?
Well, there, of course, Eskridge was the first one, and George Wilson was put in at the instance of the governor who was impeached that year. George Wilson lasted less than 60 days. And then we had a man by the name of Tyler, who was dean of engineering, who was acting president for a while. And then Bradford Knapp came as president, and he served for 4 years. It was following his administration, of course, that Dr. Bennett came, and with him the beginning of stability. But up to that time, it was very much of a political institution. Well, with that experience in 21 and 23, the alumni became aroused and continually talked and worked for a different setup for our Board of Regents. It was not until 1928, however, that the Former Students Association was organized and formed on a permanent basis. Up to that time, the alumni had been very much of a volunteer organization with no paid secretarial help, and naturally their efforts could not be very closely organized or tied together. But in 1928, a group of interested and rather distinguished alumni formed the organization and set about to amend the state constitution to get a Board of Regents for the institution. And there were 3 things we wanted. One was a long-term board. Instead of just being to serve during one governor, we wanted a board to serve for, say, 9 years. And then we didn't want all the board to change at one time. Just one member to go off each year. We get a new member every year. Therefore, you could have continuity of policy in that way. And one man coming on one year, he couldn't change the whole setup even if he wanted to. And the third provision that we insisted on was that members of the Board of Regents, while being appointed by the governor and approved by the Senate, could be removed only for cause and not at the whim of a politician, as had been the case up to that time. Well, of course, that looks like a very sensible provision for regents for an institution, and now most of our institutions are governed by a somewhat similar board. But you can hardly imagine the opposition that would come from the political circles, because they didn't want to lose this patronage and this opportunity to get their friends a good job at the institution.
Had goodies to give out.
So it took a vote of the people of Oklahoma to amend the Constitution, and it was this measure to secure a separate Board of Regents was voted on at 3 different times, once in 1930, once in 36, and once in 44. And of course the catch to amending the Constitution, which was put in by politicians back in 1907 when it was adopted, that if an amendment was voted on at a general election, a provision was that a majority of all the votes cast at the election were required for the measure to pass. If an amendment were voted on at a special election, it required only a majority of the votes cast on that amendment. So, and there was no provision of arriving at the figure for which of the total number of votes cast in the election. Now, you have the figures there, I believe, about the number of, well, yeah, there were, in 1936, it was called Question 210, and there were 379,405 yes votes and 209,996 no votes. So there were almost twice as many yes votes as no votes. And the total vote, if you would count the highest number of votes cast for any office in each precinct in the state, the total number of votes was only 749, so we had a clear majority of yes votes for the amendment. But there's no law saying how you'd arrive at the total number, and so the election board, being subject to political control also, just refused to declare the measure carried. The Attorney General ruled that it had carried, but the election board wouldn't follow the Attorney General's opinion. The Former Students Association carried it to the Supreme Court, and had it in court for a year and a half, but it still was not declared passed. But finally, in 1944, with the cooperation of Governor Kerr, we got the measure submitted at a special election. Of course, to have a special election, the governor has to call the election and determine what questions will be voted on. And the other governors never would do that for us. But Governor Kerr called a special election for a vote on this measure in 1944, and of course it carried by a nice majority, just as it had in previous elections. And Governor Kerr appointed a 9-member board with overlapping membership, removable only for cause, and we've had no further interference from the standpoint of political patronage on the way of appointments and so forth. And so we're proud to have had a little part in carrying on those campaigns for the Regents Amendment. And
Well, does that cover all the states of the, all the colleges of the state, all the universities of the state, or just OSU?
it covers OSU and the other agricultural colleges, not all the colleges in the state, but it covers the institutions at Miami and at Wilburton and at Goodwill and at Cameron down at Lawton and Warner. So it covers all of the institutions that are under this Board of Regents. Of course, other institutions have similar boards now, but it's not the same board.
You were speaking of some of the presidents a while ago. Go back to a few that we didn't even mention. Was Dr. Connell? Was he the first president of the?
No, Dr. Connell was.
Connell, excuse me.
He was president when I came here as a student in 1913, and he was a tall, dignified, well-dressed individual, and I thought he was an ideal type so far as conduct and appearance was concerned for being president of an institution, and he was one of our great presidents. He was followed by J.W. Cantwell, who was president most of the time while I was a student here. And of course, Dr. Eskridge came in 21, and George Wilson, the man who was here less than 60 days, followed by Bradford Knapp, and then by Henry G. Bennett in 1928.
You had something to do with the student union as we know it now.
Well, of course, when I first came here, soon after that, there was that was a time when student unions were being established in various universities over the country. That started back in the late 20s, that movement for student unions, and many of them were built as memorials to the veterans of the First World War, and most of them were financed by putting on a big campaign, get donations from a lot of people and building a student union. Now, all institutions didn't have them, but I say that was the period that they were being established, and we sought one and felt the need of having a center for student life on the campus. And President Bennett, of course, was very much interested in that, and the Alumni Board was also. And we worked together with our alumni organization and with the President's office in making a study of student unions, how they were secured and how they were operated, and different things about them. I think it's very fortunate that we came along a little later in getting our student union, because we had the benefit of all of the experience of these beginnings of student unions on the other campuses throughout the country. And in 1935, that was 15 years before we actually got a student union here, Dr. Bennett called me one day and said they're having a national convention of student union directors down at the University of Texas. I wish you'd go down and see what you can find out about student unions. So I went and took the president of the Student Association with me. We spent about 3 days there, and of course we came back and reported to him about the organization, what was set up, and at that time I became an associate member of the student union's national organization. We couldn't become a member because we didn't have a student union, but we could be an associate member and thereby receive the publications and keep up with the information and attend the conventions and things of that kind. And in the years following 1935, of course, I received the publications and I visited quite a number of student unions around the country, down at Oklahoma University and at Illinois University and Utah and Colorado and Iowa State and different places, and visited with the student union directors and surveyed their programs. And of course I was in touch with President Bennett in connection with that and helped him to secure information about how these were financed to begin with, how they operated, how much they cost, how big they were, and things of that kind. And of course that was covered quite a long period of time, 15 years in fact, but we were more or less familiar with how they're financed and their different functions. And so when we did finally arrive at a plan whereby we could get the plant financed completely by money from the federal government, just really we borrowed the money, of course, on blue sky to be paid back from the income from the union. Plant financed completely by money from the federal government. Just really we borrowed the money, of course, on blue sky to be paid back from the income from the union. Our union, to start with, I think cost about $4.5 million, but we didn't have to have anything to put in started. So we built the union and got into it in 1951, and the hotel part and the renting of the spaces for shops and stores and the bowling and different things that are carried on, bookstore at the Union Building, and the food service, all of those things together, the income from them has been sufficient to finance the indebtedness, in fact to practically liquidate the matter. So a few years ago we were able to add $2.5 million addition, making our present union about a $7 million plant, and it's a very active place.
Who designed your building?
I'm not. I don't know who the architect was. Of course, our architectural department here at the university assisted, but they were employed architects. But I don't recall the name of the person. But we think we have one of the very best student union operations from the standpoint of building and arrangement and space and use and program that there is in the whole country.
And the Alumni Association was mainly responsible?
Well, I wouldn't say that. I'd say we were cooperating with the administration in securing the advanced information and all of that. I think
well, you dreamed some dreams anyway.
the credit for securing this building
Yes.
Should go largely to Dr. Bennett. He was the genius that really put this institution on the map in many, many ways. When he came first in 1928, one of the first things he did was to set up a planning committee to look ahead for 25 years to see what developments we should have in the way of buildings, and he developed what was called the 25-year plan, and he had a large drawing of it in his office covering a considerable portion of one wall, and when you'd visit his office he'd always direct your attention to the progress on the 25-year plan. The student union, of course, was one of the high points in his planning program. The university library was one, and the location of the various buildings on there was a part of the diagram. And up to that time, there'd been no plan for the development of the institution. Anytime we got an appropriation where we could get a building, we'd figure out a place to put it. But the architecture and the location was a purely an individual matter and was not part of an overall plan which he set up. And in this beginning of his administration, he set up this plan, and he practically was able to carry it to completion before his untimely death.
The greatest strides in the university were under Dr. Bennett, were they not?
Well, certainly up to that time. Up to that time. Since that time,
Well, that's what I meant.
since that time, the institution has, with the momentum that was initiated under his administration, and with the change in the financial picture that has enabled universities throughout the country to develop and grow, and with the great increase in attendance due to the GI Bill of Rights and the help that's secured from so many sources to students go to school, we haven't lost any of that development and growth, but it certainly was
Well, Dr.
initiated
Bennett
under him and
actually
planned.
brought the stability to the college. did he
That's
not?
right, certainly. And before we got the stable board of regents,
Yeah.
he was able, through his personal magnetism and leadership, to develop a stable, reasonably stable administration. And that was a personal accomplishment on his part. But he was subject too to the same influences of political control that had been practiced so freely in former years. But it was through his cooperation also with Governor Kerr and with the alumni that we were able to get the Board of Regents that has placed us on a basis where we can set up a policy of operation with reference to tenure for the staff and with reference to long-term programs at the institution that really helps to make it a great institution. But without this amendment to the Constitution, to give this long-term Board of Regents with overlapping membership and being removable only for cause, without that, we could lapse back in a day's time to being a purely political football for politicians. But I think we've gone so far now that no one would, outside of some politician who wanted to use it for his own purposes, would think of allowing such a thing to happen.
You have a tabulation here that I think is very interesting, Mr. Martin, about the graduates and the degrees, and I notice on this that Dr. Bennett signed so many of such a large percentage of the degrees.
Well, of course, it was a small institution before he came.
Yes.
There hadn't been very many degrees granted. In fact, up till the time he came in 1928, there had been only a total of 2,636 degrees granted by this institution.
Now, when was this institution founded?
In 1891. And December 14th, 1891 was the first day of school down in the Congregational Church in Stillwater.
Oh, really?
And there's another thing that Dr. Bennett did. When he first came, he sat up December 14th, which was the first day of school in 91, as Founders Day. And each year that he was here, we celebrated Founders Day. He would invite back all the former presidents and all of the early day graduates of the institution, and we'd have a big banquet. And we were creating a name for the institution and uniting the support of all of the friends of the institution and looking ahead to this 25-year plan and the things that he always looked ahead.
He was a visionary man, wasn't he?
Well, he was a man of vision. Yes, but he would always look at the past and the present, and then his emphasis was always on the future. And he was marvelous in that he was able to bring those visions to reality, just like the university library, for instance. He could have had a library here a long time before he got this one, but he didn't want a small library. He didn't want one that was inadequate. He regarded the library as the center of the university, and he waited until he was able to get one that was appropriate to the institution before he got one. But the library and the student union, we could have had a student union much earlier, but we took a longer period of time until we were able to get one that can rank with the best of the type of operation in the country. And so he had visions of grandeur, but he also had ways of bringing his dreams to reality.
We were talking about that. I'm so glad you went into his personality. He must have been a very magnificent man. And we were saying here that while he was president, that he signed 88, what is that?
Before, during his last year, he had signed a total of 88 and 69/100% of all the degrees that had been conferred at this institution. And of course he was, I guess he must have been about the 14th president. And all the rest of them had signed only 12% of the degrees. And he had, of course, the graduate work had been started before he came, but there had been very little done along that line. But by the time he graduated, he had signed 97.5% of all the advanced degrees that had been conferred here.
Tell me something about some of the other presidents that you knew real well, some of the things about their personality. We've talked about them shortly, but not really. And you knew all those men personally. What did you really think of?
Oh, yes. I've known all of them personally since 1913, and I've really have counted them as personal friends because being a little older than most students and being connected with student publications and with the newspaper and so forth, I had occasion to meet them. Well, I thought a great deal of them. J.W. Cantwell was an easy man to talk to and was always very kind and very helpful. But as I mentioned a while ago, he said the politicians put him in and they also put him out. I think he felt like he'd been fired maybe when he left, and probably was, but I had a high regard for him. He was primarily, I think, a public school man. He was superintendent of schools at Fort Worth, Texas before he came here, and he knew how to operate and administer a school. Dr. Eskridge was a rather austere-looking man. He was friendly, but he was a scholar and proud of it. He was a Latin scholar and a Greek scholar, and he used to tell us about how he would read his Greek from time to time to keep up on it. And but he was not a bad president, but he wasn't here long enough, really, and wasn't given the support and cooperation that a man would need in order to develop a great institution. I think that was primarily due to the political setup rather than to the man. George Wilson, of course, had been at the institution in the extension service prior to this time. I understand he never did even have a bachelor's degree, but...
And was president?
Yes, and he was regarded as a purely political appointment, and when he came up here, the students were, well, you'd almost think you're down in the days of present time, when they have student riots, it wasn't quite that bad. But when the day he came, the students went out and mounted a burlap sacks on the flagpole. And when he came, he brought a bodyguard along with him to protect him from being assaulted physically.
Governor then, do you remember?
A man by the name of Jack Walton. Do you remember him?
No, I don't.
Jack Walton was a dictator type individual, and of course he didn't stay governor very long. He was impeached and put out of office, and M.E. Trapp was the lieutenant governor, and Trapp made a pretty good governor. But George Wilson came because of Jack Walton, and that's the way he came along. Bradford Knapp I didn't know quite so well because I was away most of the time while he was here, but I did know him personally. In fact, he gave a commencement address for me up at Veneta one time, and he was a leader in the field of agriculture. The institution, of course, was known as an A&M college and was thought of pretty largely as agriculture, but it was about this time that the other divisions of the institution began to develop, and as we have now, I think, 8 different colleges that go to make up the university. And
It hasn't always been co-ed, has it?
yes, it has been co-ed, and in fact, you can get some interesting stories back in the early days of the co-ed part. You know, it's always been a military training institution, and when the first year that the college was in operation, the interpretation was placed on this military requirement that everybody that attended the institution, including the girls, had to take military training. So I don't know how long that went on, but that was in the beginning. And
But did they actually follow through with it?
oh yes, they followed through with it, and I wasn't here then, of course, and I don't remember much about it except some of the stories the early day faculty people used to tell about how they instructed the girls to keep their thumbs at the seams of their pants and things like that. But they soon learned that the military training was for the men. But it's always been coeducational. But men have always been in the majority. In fact, we've usually had about twice as many men as we've had women enrolled. My class of 1919 was the first graduating class to have more women in it than men, and of course that was a war class in 1919. We had 26 men and 42 women in the class, but up to that time it had always been a majority of men in each graduating class. I don't know just what the ratio is now, but I'm sure there are quite a few more men than women. Maybe not quite 2 to 1, but probably 3 to 2, something like that.
Then you came, well then we came to Dr. Bennett, didn't we?
Well, yes, we've talked about him some. Of course, if anyone is interested in checking the history of Dr. Bennett, I think the best source of complete information about Dr. Bennett and Mrs. Bennett personally and for their accomplishments both here and up to the time of their death is found in the memorial issue of the Oklahoma A&M College magazine for February 1952. In this publication, which can be found in the library and in the alumni office, there are 20 articles written by different people devoted to memorial matters and historical matters concerning the things that these two great people did. And this magazine is completely devoted to this memorial copy. There, ordinarily, we would have a good many ads in the magazine. There's no advertising in this February 1952 issue. It's purely a memorial issue with Dr. Bennett's picture on the front and quite a number of other photographs and pictures scattered throughout the magazine illustrating his activities. Of course, at the time of the death, he was a national and an international figure in that he was the first director of the Point Four program, which was started under President Harry Truman's administration as a service to the underdeveloped countries in the world, where our country sought to make available to other countries who wanted to develop the information about science and farming and progress that we had. And Dr. Bennett was the first director of the Point Four program and made a very distinguished beginning in that work that has been carried on since that time.
Let's go on and talk about your 1919 prize memorial.
Well, that's an interesting story, but
You tell it first.
okay. The 1919 class was a war class. The war had just been closed with an armistice in November of 1918. The 1919 class was a torn-up class in many ways. Most of the people who had originally been with that class had gone into service and dropped out and maybe came back at later dates. And some of those in the class were older and some who had been with other classes but had joined the class late. It was a small class. In fact, it was the smallest class in numbers that had been at the institution since 1911. We had 46 members, 46 women and
26 men and 42 women.
26 men and 42 women. We had 66 members in all. Well, it was custom for classes upon graduation to leave a class memorial. In the 1919 class, being small and more or less disorganized, they didn't do much about getting a memorial until pretty close to the time of graduation, and we had raised only about $197 for the purpose of leaving a memorial on the campus. And we didn't know what we wanted to leave, so we just didn't leave anything. The president of the class, Lawrence Stokesbury, had custody of the money. And since we didn't know what to do with it and didn't have enough to do much good anyway, we just left it with him, and we decided we'd find out later what kind of a memorial we wanted to get. We came back, some of us, not very many, in 5 years, 10, 15 for class reunions, but made no progress or didn't pay much attention to the memorial, except Mr. Stokesbury did give us a report every 5 years that he had put the money on deposit with some savings and loan or something, and interest had been added to it, and it was growing. Finally, after 20 years, on the 20th anniversary, Mr. Stokesbury said, "I've had this money long enough. It's grown from $197 to $375, but I'm going to turn it over to somebody." So the class at this 20th anniversary reunion appointed a new committee to take the money and to find out what kind of memorial we wanted and to bring it back to the next reunion. That was in 1939. The committee to whom this money was turned was Henry Dunleavy and A.O. Martin. Well, 5 years later, when we had our 25th anniversary in 1944, we didn't have any class reunions. That was another war year. So the committee continued on. And at the 30th anniversary, really during the year prior to the 30th anniversary in 1949, Henry and I made a study and survey of the class with reference to what kind of a memorial they wanted. And after considerable correspondence and referendums to the members of the class, we decided to buy a war memorial for the war dead of the First World War. So we purchased a beautiful bronze plaque, 36 by 42 inches, and we presented it at the 30th anniversary of the graduation of the 1919 class. It was unveiled at the general reunion occasion over in Murray Hall. Al Darlow made the presentation, and of course Dr. Bennett made the acceptance for the University of the memorial. After that, we placed it at the entrance to the library building, and it was on display there for several years. In fact, up till the time that that building was torn down. We got a new library, and a much larger one, and it didn't have places in it for that kind of display. And so the old library was torn down, and the memorial was placed in storage with a view to putting it on display in the new memorial chapel, which was in the planning stage at that time. We were going to place there also the names of the World War dead of the Second World War. Well, this first memorial and the second one really never has completely materialized. And because of the lack of harmony between the two types of things, there were so many more in the Second World War than there were in the first. Ours was a small number, but and our memorial plaque had them in large letters and all that. The memorial was placed in storage, and it wasn't brought out several years. But when we had our 50th anniversary in 1969, we went to the storage room and brought it out, mounted it, and put it on display, and we had it in a conspicuous place during the 50th anniversary of our class. We, of course, had it before all of the reunion classes that year in the big banquet that was held. And then it was sat back in the alumni office for 3 or 4 months where it could be seen. But we were not successful in getting it into the memorial chapel. In fact, it drifted back to the storeroom in the alumni office, and that's where it is today. We are still hopeful that it can be placed someplace on the campus where when the members of our class come back, they'll know to go see it, or when the present students can see it and see who gave their lives in the First World War, and so that any visitors to the campus can see it, because we think it is as nice a memorial as any class has left. Of course, there's a lot of sentiment connected with it. It's not an active thing, but we want to get it out of the storeroom, and we'd like to get it either attached to some wall in a place where it could be seen by many of our visitors, or we'd like to see it placed over in the memorial chapel. But anyway, that's where it is now, and it's such a fine piece of bronze and so well done that we don't think it's going to perish even if the building had burned down, but we hope it'll not stay buried for all time to come.
What is the objection to it being in the memorial chapel?
Well, there's no particular objection, except there's not a particular place there where the committee or people in charge would put it. We've never been turned down. They don't say no, you can't do that, but they just don't. Nobody says, well, let's place it here. Who has the authority to say that? No one has ever criticized the memorial in any way, and no one has ever said No, they are all very complimentary about it and say we ought to be proud of it and all that, and it certainly ought to be placed where it can be seen. You won't find anybody that has seen it or that you talk to about it but what will say that. But, you know, getting a thing done is something different. And I think since I'm a member of that class and had a part in securing the memorial, I think I'll finally uh, talk about it to the right people enough until it will be attached to some place where it can be seen. I'm going to use this information that I have put together in rather concrete form to submit to different people who are in positions that might be helpful in getting it placed, and I certainly hope will be, and I'm not discouraged about it. I think I can understand the thinking and situation because it's not something that just fits into a picture. It's different, and there's so many important things to do at the moment and any day that comes up that it's easy to put things off when all it does is honor people who gave their lives more than 50 years ago.
But isn't that one of the most important things now that we're looking for is tradition? We're trying to find that tradition.
Well, we think so. We think so, and it seemed to be the will of the class because it was not bought unthoughtedly. It was there was a good deal of attention given to the choice and selection, and of course we think it's rather unique in that our money grew from less than $200 to $500, which was the cost of this plaque in this 30 years time, and so we're proud of it, and we hope that anybody that might have occasion to hear this recording would look see if they can find it.
And we just may find it through this recording. Who knows? You had a wonderful 50th anniversary then, didn't you?
Well, that is for our class reunion
class.
you're thinking about.
Yes.
This 50th anniversary you're mentioning there, I believe, is
this one, yes.
In 1941. See, this institution was established and founded in 1891. The first classes met in the Congregational Church downtown on December 14th, 1891.
Is that church still standing?
No, it isn't. But in 1941, we observed the 50th anniversary of the founding of the institution. It was similar to other founders' days that Dr. Bennett had fostered during his tenure here, except that it was carried on during the entire year, and a great deal of factual and historical information was accumulated through articles written by members of the first graduating class, first faculty members, and
But isn't that one of the most important things now that we're looking for is tradition? We're trying to find that tradition.
well, we think so. We think so, and it seemed to be the will of the class because it was not bought unthoughtedly. It was there was a good deal of attention given to the choice and selection, and of course we think it's rather unique in that our money grew from less than $200 to $500, which was the cost of this plaque in this 30 years time, and so we're proud of it, and we hope that anybody that might have occasion to hear this recording would see if they can find it.
And we just may find it through this recording. Who knows? You had a wonderful 50th anniversary then, didn't you?
Well, that is for our class reunion you're thinking about.
Yes.
This 50th anniversary you're mentioning there, I believe, is
this one, yes.
in 1941. See, this institution was established and founded in 1891. The first classes met in the Congregational Church downtown on December 14th, 1891.
Is that church still standing?
No, it isn't. But in 1941, we observed the 50th anniversary of the founding of the institution. it was similar to other founders' days that Dr. Bennett had fostered during his tenure here, except that it was carried on during the entire year, and a great deal of factual and historical information was accumulated through articles written by members of the first graduating class, first faculty members, and early day presidents, and people who were acquainted with the institution in the beginnings and its development since that time. A great many articles were compiled and written, and we published a lot of them in the Oklahoma A&M College magazine, and a lot of them were published in the Daily Oklahoma Legion, the student newspaper. Those have been assembled and put together with other memorial things that were connected with the early history of the institution. And there's been a box in which redskins and newspapers, publications and stories and pictures have been assembled, and it's been sealed and placed in our new library to be opened in 1991 for those who are here to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the institution. And a lot of us have our names in there, and some have contributions of various kinds in that collection, and we hope it'll be an interesting historical experience for those who are here to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the founding of the institution.
With your placement work, can you remember some of the people who have really made a name for themselves through your placement bureau?
Well, I suppose I could mention quite a few names. However, I don't think of anybody who's become a senator or governor or anything like that. But I still get around over the country a little bit, and I meet with the retired teachers' organizations in this state and in some other states, and I never go to a meeting. But what I run on to folks that remember former days, and very frequently they'll say, well, you helped me get my first job. I was out here on the golf course about a month ago, and a young man came up to me and says, you probably don't know me. He says, I'm Lee Snyder. You helped me get my first job. Well, Lee, of course, is now, he's our football coach for our freshman football team, and is making a name for himself as a coach. He's a fine young man. Well, things of that kind, it was usually the first job after people have established themselves in their vocation or in their job. They usually move.
The sound is distorted at the end of this tape because Mrs. Jones was running out of recording tape before Mr. Martin could finish his remarks. There is no sign-off on this interview for that reason.
Sure.